So, time for us to talk a little bit more about the specifics of screwball and romantic comedy. In some ways, screwball is a subgenre of romantic comedy or a satire of romantic comedy. But you'll remember, right, that as we said, genre is about categories of stories with conventions, and those create expectations on the part of audiences. That means they when we identify what the characteristics are of a particular genre, that gives us a clue to what it is audiences are seeking when they go to see these films. So in romantic comedy, this means our happy ending equals a romantic union. And the narrative consists of a comic path of courtship. So, various different events, points along a path of courtship where they are united, and it's funny along the way. So that's what romantic comedy is. So, usually, in terms of the particular obstacles, what we have in romantic comedy is characters who seem compatible, obviously compatible to us, the audience, but there are obstacles that keep them apart. And usually those involve them not recognizing that they are so compatible. One or the other, or maybe both of them, don't recognize their mutual compatibility, while we, the audience, see, oh, why can't they see they have magical chemistry? Of course they belong together. So the appeal of romantic comedy may have to do with how it can bear similarities with the vicissitude of romance, the various different things that happen, and you can't predict or know what's going to happen next, right? And how similar that can be both in stories, which may be a heightened form of it. Movies are usually going to be very heightened, more heightened realism than real. But there is a similarity into the unpredictability of romance in the real world. And of course, when we're watching a romantic comedy, we know that it's going to work out. It's got to work out. And of course, we're also not implicated in the story personally. It will not be our hearts that are going to be broken, right? So we can observe it and we can enjoy the ups and downs of this comic path towards the union. Now, Screwball, as a variety of romantic comedy, is quite different, both in terms of the characteristics of what happens as well as what the film really sounds like, especially. So, in terms of its characters, the leads in the Screwball are much more eccentric than others who may be in the film. So, the leads are much more quirky. There are aspects of them where they just don't seem to fit in. There's something eccentric about our lead characters, one of them at least, in the Screwball comedy. Another really important aspect of the Screwball comedy is a sense of excessive language. Excessive meaning more, be above and beyond the typical ways in which we have language in films. So that can be speed. They can talk much more quickly than normal human beings do. They may be much more witty. The things that they say are just on whole funnier than typical people in films. And the quantity of language, how much they talk. This is another measure of excessiveness. So Screwball is known for excessive language. And when we watch it as viewers today, it'll be very obvious to you, I believe, when you watch the Philadelphia story, how quickly they talk. Even though it's a much more realistic narrative environment, say, than something like Duck Soup and the Marx Brothers. So the thing about this is, it may be that excessive speech is one area where sexuality is displaced. That is sexual tension. We're not allowed to see sex, nudity, and sexual energy. We can't even see lustful kissing, as we talked about, right? But what we can have is language. So those eruptions of language and speech may be one way in which that sexual tension comes to the surface. So this genre of the Screwball comedy is identified, and it really peaks in the 1930s. And of course, you have to have dialogue for the Screwball comedy. So it cannot exist before this. But this is one thing. What can you do with sound? Well, you can have lots of dialogue, and you can have fast-paced dialogue. You can have very clever dialogue. What's kind of interesting, though, is how it falls out of favor after this, and it doesn't. There just are not that many examples after this period of time. Another characteristic is that the women in screwball comedies are very forward and aggressive in a way that we don't typically have in romantic comedies. They're very exceptional. They have an exceptional forwardness. They are very active and seeking what it is that they want, outspoken usually, and therefore there is more overt competition in the screwball comedy than we might see in a traditional romantic comedy. Our heroes or our heroines usually act like they can do whatever they want. And in fact, quite often, one reason they can do that is because they are rich. The screwball, like I said, this peaks in the 1930s, which is the era of the Great Depression. The 1930s is also the peak of musicals, really. And I think that in a way, these stories are a kind of escapist entertainment. But the lead characters also have this fantastic life where they can behave in these ways eccentrically because they have money, and so they don't have any real worries outside of romance. So what we see in here is not just a battle in terms of who wants something or who's trying to achieve it, but a transformation of character, learning to be different in order to have a romantic pairing. Some specifics about the Philadelphia story. So the Philadelphia story is released at the end of 1940, and it's kind of interesting from a production standpoint. The lead actress is Katharine Hepburn, who was a popular star in the 30s up until about the mid-30s, and she had a series of failed films and was kind of identified as being box office poison, meaning if you had her in a movie, people wouldn't want to go see her. That's how she got labeled, unfortunately, and she had a hard time getting in films. And she left Hollywood and went and starred in the theatrical play of the Philadelphia story, which was successful. And she bought the rights to the play with some financial help from Howard Hughes, as a matter of fact. And the idea was, by doing that, she controlled this story, and she could use that to make her comeback in Hollywood. And she did. MGM, one of the major studios, bought the rights to this film, and they were still concerned about Katharine Hepburn. So one of the things they did is they paired her with two A-list stars, Cary Grant and Jimmy Stewart. This film is just like, it is a star-studded, it's one of my favorite films of all time, I have to say. It is a star-studded film, and each of these characters are fantastic comic actors. It was also directed by George Cukor, who was one of the very few openly gay male directors anyway, in Hollywood at this time, and was known for being for doing comedies and being a successful comedy film director. So just some questions for you to think about as you watch this film. It's also known as being a comedy of remarriage, and that means quite what it sounds like. You have a couple who used to be married, they're split up, and now the question is, will they get back together? And that, in fact, is one way to get around the code, and the code said you couldn't have extramarital sex. You couldn't have sex or adultery. So if you had characters that were divorced, then they could go and they could do things, and it wouldn't be, a more mortal sin. Think in terms of eccentricity. What is eccentric about our leads? Who's normal? Are there, in fact, normal people in this film? And who might those people be in terms of not our main characters, but our supporting ones? How important is narrative structure versus performance? I think you're going to see it's much more important than, say, the anarchistic comedies, but still we have a linking together of different kinds of performances. To what extent is the female character transformed in this film? To what extent does Katharine Hepburn have to change who she is and what she's like in order to have the successful marriage?